Doreen, do you think we should give up on the live stream part? And now that you're recording it, okay. Jeremy, Doreen turned on the record on Zoom, so we're just going to go with that.
Okay, yeah, I'm really sorry about this, but can't seem to figure it out.
Yeah, it's okay.
All right, well, in any case, we're recording this in Zoom, and I'll be able to make it happen up on YouTube and stuff. All right, well, thanks everybody for attending. My name is Jeremy Love. I'm on the boards of New Hampshire Peace Action and National Peace Action. New Hampshire Peace Action educates, mobilizes, and organizes to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envision a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. In the spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we do our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. And a reminder of Zoom guidelines. We're happy to have you keep your video on so we can see your faces and reactions and feel connected here. We ask that you keep your audio muted if you aren't talking. The chat's a great place for you to share reactions and ask questions, and we'll get to in the second half of the program. Our every other week online conversation series began in July 2020 as a way to stay connected to each other and to continue to sort out how to make the changes in our society for which we work and yearn. I welcome you to New Hampshire Peace Action's Justice Conversation commemorating the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Last week, we held our annual vigil beside the Merrimack River in Concord, and I was excited by all the new faces that took time from their day to reflect, share, and build. Thank you for coming. I feel we owe the Concord Monitor some gratitude for running not only an op-ed that Reverend Theo Harris of the Poor People's Campaign and Diane Swords of the Back from the Brink Hub in Syracuse, New York authored. The paper ran a front page piece that was above the fold specifically about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the vigil that we were holding. Will, our executive director, although I know we weren't supposed to be talking to him about work stuff, board friends and New Hampshire Peace Action friends, but I did anyways. He seems to think that this might be the first time that in New Hampshire Peace Action's 40-year history that we've received advanced coverage of our work. So that's really a big deal. And either way, this is a really great opportunity. This is an opportunity to keep the conversation going, and I hope we're able to build a persistent drumbeat of coverage in papers across the state. If you'd like to help out, need some resources, or want to learn about New Hampshire Peace Action's work on nuclear weapons, please reach out. We're a coalition partner of Back from the Brink, bringing communities together to abolish nuclear weapons, a national grassroots campaign which is mobilizing the public and sounding the alarm with a very simple message. We need to get rid of nuclear weapons before they get rid of us. Back from the Brink is the main vehicle for most of our anti-nuclear weapons work here at New Hampshire Peace Action and has generated tremendous momentum since its genesis in 2017. Since then, more than 400 organizations nationwide, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, Union of Concerned Scientists, Sierra Club, Indivisible, the Hip Hop Caucus, Natural Resource Defense Council, and others have endorsed this platform, as have 330 local state elected officials and 60 municipalities, including Boston, Philadelphia, Salt Lake City, Baltimore, Minneapolis, and our most recent, Chicago, as well as 6 legislative bodies. Prominent individual endorsers include Secretary of Defense William Perry and publisher of The Nation, Katrina Vanderhoevel. So again, if you'd like to help, you can email me at jeremy@preventnuclearwar.org. And one of the policy solutions prescribed from Back from the Brink is the United States adopt an official no first use policy for nuclear weapons. Were the US to adopt a no first use policy, they'd be joining China and India, both of which have versions of such a policy. Here with us tonight to talk about the policy of no first use is Professor Elaine Scarry. Professor Scarry teaches at Harvard University as the Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and a Senior Fellow at Harvard Society of Fellows. She lectures nationally and internationally in nuclear war, law, literature, and medicine, and has been a Guggenheim Fellow as well as a Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Studies in Palo Alto, the Getty Research Center in Los Angeles, and the National Humanities Center in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Her awards include honorary degrees from Northwestern University in the US and Uppsala University in Sweden, and most recently the Zabel Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters for a writer of progressive, original, and experimental tendencies. In 2005, Prospect Magazine and Foreign Policy named her one of top 100 leading intellectuals. Her most recent book, Thermonuclear Monarchy, Choosing Between Democracy and Doom, shows that nuclear weapons and democratic governance are mutually exclusive. It specifies the constitutional roles available, or tools available for dismantling the country's nuclear architecture. Her article, The Racist Foundation of Nuclear Architecture, appeared in Boston Review and in Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Professor Scarry, the Zoom is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. And I'm very, very honored that I was invited by Jeremy Love and New Hampshire Peace Action to speak to you tonight. And also I'm very delighted to see some loyalists from Mass Peace Action like Emma Pike and Susan Mirsky and others. So thank you, all of you, for being here on this summer evening. I mean, as Jeremy said, we are commemorating Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'll just, before starting the lecture, I'll just say that when I went to those two cities, one thing that really struck me when I went to the museums was the number of very young school children who were there, just streaming through and standing in front of displays that were really harrowing, displays that showed photographs of injury all over the body, injuries to the face that almost wiped out your grasp that this was a human being. And I would really contrast that with our country's own inability to acknowledge the injuries that happened there. There was one moment in a couple of years ago when a colleague and I set up a 1 month long exhibit at one of Cambridge's libraries, and we were very grateful to them for that. But after we put up an exhibit, when we got in the next morning, all photographs or even drawings by children of injuries had been taken down. And there are many other examples of that inability to look at the injury. Probably all of you know the famous story of the Smithsonian hoping to have an event that acknowledged and honored the people harmed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it created so much controversy that they had to cancel the exhibition. And in the end, the only thing they exhibited was the Enola Gay, the airplane that had delivered the bomb. In other words, far from understanding it from the point of view of those injured, what it put into the representational space was an image of the US nuclear power. So as Jeremy said, tonight I'm going to be talking about our country's first use policy and the constitutional tools we have for dismantling that first use policy, and the way in which the coexistence of constitutional tools, that is national tools, side by side with international tools like the current treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, need to work together. We need both of these in order to dismantle this architecture. And there's plenty of reason for us to feel very worried right now. The tensions between the US and Russia, between US and China. Jeremy and I, and perhaps others of you, were present at the news conference today on the new research that's being published today in Nature Food, which is a leading scientific journal, showing that if there's even a small nuclear exchange between Pakistan and India, 2 billion people will die from starvation. And if there is a conflict between the US and Russia, 5 billion will die from starvation. But on the other hand, what should give us hope is that there are in our space on the table both an acknowledgement of constitutional tools and international legal tools that can be used to dismantle it. And though we've got a long, long way to go before these are made real, at least we've got them occupying a mental space. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. Hopefully I'll be able to do that. Can you see the screen now? Good. And I'll just start by a picture that gives an overview of our present situation, which is the number of warheads we presently have. And we could spend our whole time together on this chart, but let me just call your attention to a few of its most important features. First of all, each icon on this chart represents 5 warheads. The blue are submarine-launched warheads. The green are air-delivered warheads, the green are land-based, land-delivered warheads, and the red are air-delivered. And the second thing to know, I should say that the gray are those warheads that are nominally scheduled for retirement, but are not yet dismantled. So in the eyes of other countries, these are very much still an active part of our arsenal. The second thing to know is that over 90% of these warheads belong to 2 countries, the United States and Russia. Everything from 3 o'clock down to 10 o'clock is a US weapon. Everything from 8 o'clock up around moving clockwise to 1 o'clock is a Russian warhead. And then that small wedge is the arsenal possessed by the 7 other nuclear powers, the smallest being North Korea with 40 or fewer warheads, something to be very, very afraid of, but we need to see what they're looking at, what it looks like from their side. One other feature of this chart, which is made by the Nagasaki Council for Nuclear Abolition, and is to my mind the clearest visual image we have right now for our situation. But one other feature is the doomsday clock at the center from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, where, as I think you know, the clock is now set for 100 seconds to midnight, the closest that it's ever been to midnight. An example of how superfluous these weapons are is revealed by the New York Times, which a few years ago asked how many weapons would be required to decimate, that was their word, the populations of 7 countries. And those 7 countries were the following, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. And if we were to do terrible harm to their populations, by decimate, they specified that they meant 1/4 of the population was dead in each country. This is how many weapons would still remain in the US arsenal. These, and these, and these. In fact, as they wrote, more than 70% of the stockpile would remain. It can be hard to wrap one's mind around the complex nuclear architecture. So to my mind, it's very helpful to just remember that like any weapon, say a knife or a gun, the nuclear architecture has 2 ends, the end at which people are injured and the end at which the weapons are fired. And in both those cases, nuclear weapons are immoral in a way that we've never experienced on Earth before. What makes the injuring end of the nuclear weapon unusual is the catastrophically high number of people on a single afternoon. That's why we speak of them as weapons of mass destruction and recognize the obscenity of that number. But we should also recognize that what makes them morally obscene is what is happening at the other end of the weapon, that all those deaths can be brought about by the launch order of a single individual, whether that is the head of a country or a hacker who has appropriated the launch codes or whatever. We know that during Trump's administration, the United States became more aware, the United States population became more aware that throughout the nuclear age, we have had a presidential first use policy, a policy that we wouldn't use them in retaliation. Instead, we would use them first. And that all the use of them would be given to one person who had sole authority, and no other break would be on that. No one else in the cabinet, in the Congress, in the Supreme Court, or certainly in the population would have the power to stop it. While we are all aware of how reckless someone like Trump appeared to us, we should be aware that while in his case it was only possible that he was contemplating the use of a nuclear weapon, we have the historical record to tell us with certainty that Eisenhower twice considered using them, in 1954 in the Taiwan Straits crisis, again in 1959 in the Berlin crisis. That according to Robert McNamara, under JFK's presidency, the United States came 3 times within a hair's breadth, that was McNamara's term, within a hair's breadth of all-out nuclear war. Nixon crowed that he had considered using them 4 different times. And we know that LBJ considered using a nuclear weapon to stop China from acquiring a nuclear weapon. The actual record stops there only because none of this is public until 30 years after a president leaves office. So Biden could be right now considering using a nuclear weapon, and only people 30 years from now would know about it, et cetera. The other reason why I think it's useful to think about these 2 ends of the weapon is because international law addresses the injuring end of the weapon. It says you can't carry out that kind of injury to humanity. In contrast, constitutional law, both in the United States and in the constitutions of other nuclear powers, constitutional law addresses the firing end of the weapon. It says you can't begin to injure a foreign population unless and until you have passed that by and deliberated about it, both in your Congress and among your civilization. And those constitutional provisions have been utterly thrown in the trash during the nuclear age. On the other hand, if we begin to reanimate them, we will be able to dismantle the nuclear arsenal because they're utterly incompatible. The reason we've jettisoned those crucial provisions of the Constitution is because they can't be made compatible with nuclear weapons. And of course, what we should have done is said, look, they're incompatible, we better not make these nuclear weapons. Instead, we said, they're incompatible, okay, well, we'll just toss away the Constitution. By the Constitution, what I'm referring to now are 2 breaks on going to war. And though these are just 2 phrases, 2 clauses within the Constitution, the first of them has been named by many of our leading jurists in the country as the cornerstone of the Constitution. And that is the requirement that before you ever begin to injure a foreign population, you have a congressional declaration of war. As I said before, since the invention of nuclear weapons, we've stopped having congressional declarations of war. We didn't have one in Korea, didn't have one in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, et cetera, because presidents can feel, well, if I can just push a button and massacre a population, why do I have to go to Congress just because I'm going to invade former Yugoslavia or invade Panama? I'll mainly be concentrating on this first break, but there's a second break that's also been desecrated. We all know that the Second Amendment today often takes the form of people standing there with a machine gun in front of 6-year-olds which is not exactly a model of courage. But the kind of deformation of the Second Amendment is a terrible loss, because originally it was what the founders called the Palladium of Liberty. I won't, unless there's time, go into that one. I'll only be talking about the first of them, but it's important to know that nuclear weapons have eliminated both these brakes on war making. And in the book that Jeremy Love referred to, Thermonuclear Monarchy, in the part, one of the chapters that looks at this constitutional provision, contrasts the high quality of the deliberation there is in the 5 instances when we had congressional declarations of war, which is the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War of 1846, the Spanish-American War of 1898, World War I and World War II. And I contrast that high quality of deliberation with the utter absence of deliberation when presidents just hold a council where they begin to mumble about how they might have a first use launch of the nuclear weapons. And I look at the kind of things that were said during the Taiwan Straits crisis under Eisenhower in 1954 and the Berlin crisis in 1959. And just quickly, the difference between them is outlined here on this screen. The congressional deliberations are visible to the public. They're open to the public. They can be present in the gallery. The deliberations are typed up in a transcript made available to the full population. In contrast, what happens in presidential circles is quiet, is secret for 30 years. Congress over here has a clear set of sentences during the whole deliberation, whether that lasts for 7 months or 3 days. They understand that these sentences are at stake, and the sentences are, we hereby declare a declaration of war. There's no clear statement of what's on the table in the case of presidential deliberation. A third difference is the fact that there's a conspicuously staged vote. Each person in Congress must come and say yes or no. And their names will be attached to that vote forever, just like Jeannette Rankin, we know, is the only one who voted against war with Japan. In the case of the presidential deliberation, there is no vote. There's just a kind of woolly miasma of comments being made. In the congressional deliberations, the participants are equal, whereas in the presidential deliberation, the participants are subordinate, and they therefore try and see what it is the president wants them to say, and they say it. So true is that we know that JFK used to excuse himself from deliberations to use the restroom, for example, in order to give a chance that people would come and say anything that was contrary to what was being said. The most important difference between them is that in the congressional deliberations, there's a great deal of dissent and contestation about whether the country that's being called an enemy really is an enemy. Even in the case of World War II Germany, once Pearl Harbor is attacked, the congressional deliberations just lasted a few hours. But for 6 months earlier, that Congress had been deliberating about whether or not to go to war with Germany. And there were, even in the case of Germany, there were people there testing the arguments. Everyone considers themselves equal. So everybody has a stake to try and make the best argument they can on whichever side they believe. And only if they can convince other people that this other country really is an injury, has performed acts that warrant injury to its population, that it's performed acts that our allies haven't performed, or that we ourselves haven't performed. And those are all positions that are vigorously debated in each of our previous. Do we go forward with a war? In the presidential arena, in contrast, there is no dissent. The closest thing I found to dissent was in the 1954 Taiwan Straits crisis papers, where during Eisenhower's council with his people, the Secretary of the Treasury, whose name was Humphrey, says, aren't we going to have a hard time explaining to the American people why islands with names they've never heard of, like Quemoy and Matsu, were important enough that we used an atomic weapon? Eisenhower immediately scolds him. A mere look at the wall will convince you of the strategic importance of these islands. End of dissent. No one says, I kind of agree with Secretary of Treasury Humphrey, et cetera. Again, in the 1959 crisis in Berlin, by that point, Eisenhower decided that if he just invited one or two congressmen there, maybe that would count as a congressional participation. In the Taiwan Straits, he knew he would be impeached. He said repeatedly, I'll be impeached if I do this, but I'm willing to be impeached. So one of the people there is Senator Fulbright, a person some of you have heard of. And Fulbright at some point says, I don't quite understand what we're saying. Are we saying that maybe East Germany will destroy the road in West Berlin, and that we might bring in repairmen to rebuild the road, and that an East German soldier might fire a rifle and then we would drop an atomic bomb? Eisenhower doesn't say, are you crazy, Senator Fulbright? He says, well, we don't exactly know the exact steps that will lead to our dropping the atomic bomb, but we know that if we have to do it, we won't have time to suddenly go to the UN and think about it. So the most important difference is that the very reason the founders set in place this requirement for a congressional declaration of war, not because it thought it was fun to give Congress power. No, it was to put a huge break in the path of going to war. It meant you could only go to war if you could convince what would today be 535 people that there was a reason to do so. Now, the good thing is that it's recognized that our constitutional provision is utterly incompatible with our longstanding obscene policy of presidential first use. And so we have two different bills on the floor of Congress. Will they pass? Not likely, but there's a chance. And having them there is a historic event, because in the past we've floundered around not feeling we have anything. And yet they really are probably only going to go forward if huge numbers of the population begin to demand that their own congressional representatives sign on as co-sponsors. And right now the numbers are low, but the good news is that even a very cautious paper like the New York Times has come out in favor of at least the first of these pieces of legislation. So right now, for example, both of our Massachusetts senators are co-sponsored, but only 3 of our 9 representatives have signed on as co-sponsors. And New Hampshire doesn't yet have co-sponsors in either house. With the other bill, the Warren-Smith bill, it has 5 co-sponsors in the Senate and 2 in the House. And Massachusetts senators are co-sponsors, but none of our representatives are. And I should mention that Vermont has co-sponsors. Now, the other reason to be optimistic is, amazingly, we have a president who is opposed to our policy of presidential first use. By the way, Jeremy or Amy or Doreen, I noticed that a couple of people are waiting to be admitted, and I just want to, if I should be doing anything to let them in, just let me know. Okay. So not only do we have congressional registration of this constitutional provision, and the Markey-Liu bill very explicitly says the basis for this is the constitutional requirement for a declaration of war. But in addition, we have a president who is on the record as opposing first use. He did that while he was vice president under President Obama, and he did it again on the campaign trail, most strikingly when he was in New Hampshire And he was asked a question about Elizabeth Warren's bill, and he very somewhat indignantly said, "I've been opposed to first use for 20 years, et cetera." That gave reason, or perhaps still gives people reason to hope that in the nuclear posture review, he will eventually announce a no first use policy. Again, that would be historic, and we should all be contacting him to try and bring that about. I want to just briefly note that this constitutional provision has parallels in other nuclear states. The French Constitution in Article 35 requires that its parliament oversee entry into war. And Article 89 in the French Constitution says you can make changes to this Constitution, but what you can't do is utterly nullify the Republic. And I think we should understand that having the power to massacre billions of people in one person's hand is a destruction of the Republic, both in France and in the United States. The Indian Constitution, Article 246, again, gives the power to oversee the entry into war to Congress, to its legislature. The Russian Federation also has a provision that says the president can act to protect the country up to its own border, If there's an invasion and people cross over the border, he can call out the military to begin to defend. But he cannot cross over the border without going to the Federal Council, which is the equivalent of our Senate. And it also, that same Constitution, which is the equivalent of our right to bear arms, namely, it gives to the whole population the responsibility for defending the country and tries to distribute it equally across everyone. So just as presidential first use and presidential sole authority can be eliminated, so too can the entire nuclear architecture be eliminated. What is the relation between getting rid of first use and sole authority and getting rid of the whole nuclear architecture? How does one lead to the other? And it's my contention that getting rid of first use introduces a spiral fracture into the whole architecture. And it does so because our nuclear architecture, and perhaps any nuclear architecture, depends on first use and sole authority. That's in fact why we have it. Presidential first use is the trigger of the whole architecture. Once that trigger is dismantled, the arsenal ceases to work. By the way, we know very well that it's perfectly possible physically to get rid of nuclear weapons. Sometimes it's wrongly said that you can't get rid of nuclear weapons once they're invented, which is a kind of preposterously untrue thing to say. This particular graph was made by John Ainsley. It shows that getting rid of the nuclear triggers can be done in a couple of hours. Other parts of the nuclear arsenal take longer, but once you dismantle the nuclear triggers, you're a long way, you've prevented the thing from being used to injure anyone, and the whole UK fleet can be dismantled in under 4 years. Now, the United States arsenal, as we know from that first chart I showed, is vastly larger than the UK arsenal. Nonetheless, it could be dismantled in a finite amount of time. The other thing that should give us confidence that nuclear weapons can be eliminated is the nuclear weapons free zones that blanket the whole entire Southern Hemisphere, the Treaty of Tataloka, the Treaty of Pearl Indaba, the Treaty of Bangkok, and others. And in fact, it's important to recognize that among the many obscenities of our nuclear weapons is the fact that they belong almost exclusively to the Northern Hemisphere, whereas the Southern Hemisphere are nuclear weapons free zones. Now, you also know that very recently, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted on July 7, 2017, entered into force in January 2021. Its existence hasn't been acknowledged by the United States, despite the fact that 66 nations have ratified it. What the United States thinks about it, how it defends itself against continuing to have nuclear weapons while we've got this international treaty, how it, in its own mind, if we can talk about it as having a mind, can be inferred from the kind of arguments that the United States made at the 1995 ICJ case, the ICJ case on the illegality of nuclear weapons, when other countries, 78 countries went to the UN, asked that nuclear weapons be declared illegal. We went in there and in a joint statement by the Department of State and the Department of Defense argued that having nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons, and using nuclear weapons first does not violate the Geneva Conventions, does not violate Hague, does not violate the Treaty on the Ozone Layer, does not violate the prohibition on genocide. We argued that, yeah, millions of people will die, but it wouldn't have been our intent to wipe out a particular race or ethnic group. Nonetheless, again, we can press on this international treaty and hope to get a more enlightened answer from the government. It's crucial to see that we have both these tools, amazingly, two powerful tools, international law and constitutional law. And both of them need to be used because both have advantages and they don't completely replace one another. So they arise out of the same philosophic foundations, but they have different strengths. International law brings pressure to bear on the 9 nuclear states from the outside, while constitutional law brings pressure to bear from the inside of the country. International law requires each country to be true to every other country. National law requires it to be true to itself. The leaders of nuclear states sometimes regard international law as optional. That's the way they regard it right now. It's up to us whether we want to enter the treaty. They see it as a canopy under which they may or may not choose to stand, depending on whether the law's content mirrors the leader's own wishes. Constitutional law is less forgiving. A leader does not have the option of claiming that his country stands outside its own constitution. Constitutions show mercy towards the Earth's population by placing coercive restraints on their leaders' ability to act in the arena of war. International law has among its advantages the fact that its motive is overtly ethical. It openly speaks on behalf of the Earth-wide population, which must be spared the terrifying humanitarian consequences of nuclear war. Constitutional law often lacks this explicit ethical ring. It sounds merely procedural. The US Constitution, the French Constitution, Indian Constitution, and Russian Constitution all stipulate that no leader or anyone can begin to injure a foreign population unless or until its legislature has declared war. Despite their seemingly neutral tone, these seemingly flat pieces of procedure have 2 millennia of ethical thinking embedded in their pronouncements. And in earlier centuries, the ethical content was very, very visible. It's just that it came to be embodied or enfolded into a strict rule that we had to follow. International law has the merit that its vision is total. It calls for complete elimination of nuclear weapons, as well as for reparation to those already injured by these weapons. Constitutional law, in contrast, is much narrower and at first sounds more modest. It merely takes away from leaders the license that the nuclear architecture seems to have given them, the license to single-handedly launch a weapon and to launch it first before a missile from any other country has been fired. In doing so, constitutional law has the ability to dismantle the trigger of the arsenal and therefore disable the overall nuclear architecture. I'm going to just say one more thing and then we can have questions. And if nobody has questions, I can briefly sketch what I think are the reasons that, that the mental architecture remains in place. Why does the US population and the populations of the other nuclear states not come forward and help with this? But for now, I want to just end this with something that I've been saying since I first published Thermonuclear Monarchy, and that is that you know, it may not be what we're facing right now on Earth is probably not the first time that a civilization has had to face this. Probably many of you are aware of what's called the Fermi paradox, and that was the paradox announced by the famous scientist Fermi, that how could it be that there are billions, just in this photograph, which is a tiny patch of sky, there are thousands of galaxies, and each of those galaxies has billions of stars, which have solar systems, a huge percentage of which have to have the conditions for life. And Fermi asked, how can you have this situation, and yet we've never heard from any other source? And there are many explanations that have been given to answer the Fermi paradox, but really one of the most commonly given by scientists is the fact that any species intelligent enough to communicate across planets will also be intelligent enough to create something to blow itself up with, and will, and has repeatedly blown itself up. This is just to say that part of what is making this so hard is that it really is so hard. And if we are able to pull ourselves out of it, perhaps we'll be the first planetary civilization that's been able to do it. Let me stop now and answer questions, and then continue if there are no questions. Yes, John?
Hi, thank you. I'd like to point out that your talk, which I think is very good, it is a talk for all time about why the first use policy is something that we should have adopted long ago and should still adopt. But you didn't mention something that I think is important, which is how it might mesh with the war that's going on between Russia and the Ukraine, and the kind of veiled nuclear threats, very vague so far, fortunately, about using nuclear weapons from Russia. And it strikes me that it would be a magnificent gesture, a magnificent act by the United States, and this is a perfect time to declare a no first use policy. It would put us, it would be a very strong statement regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, and a very good put down, the best possible answer, I think, for Putin's sort of veiled threats that maybe Russia would use nuclear weapons. If we declare officially and solidly that we will never use nuclear weapons first in that war or in any other. And I'd just like to mention, I think this will be a terrific time, and this will be a great move for US policy. And I wonder if we could discuss that a little bit.
Well, I certainly agree with you. And I did at the beginning allude to the tensions between the two countries. And I think that both our tensions with Russia and our tensions with China, I thought I had mentioned this, are like a playbook for how nuclear war starts. Russia made not veiled threats, very open threats, saying that it had nuclear weapons and moving its country into higher alert. I hadn't been aware that that we had made a similar statement, but it was pointed out to me that our ally, France and NATO, very openly said to Russia, and don't forget that NATO also has nuclear weapons. So the threat was there. To me, Russia's danger towards the Ukraine and towards everyone on Earth is, I think, clear. I think that the US danger is also very, very high right now. The fact that they are all along the line have been kind of luxuriating in injuries, say, to Russian generals and so forth, is just, trying to bring about a humiliation that is inappropriate. It's not a matter of gloating when soldiers die on either side. But that's just a small example of the wrong rhetoric. And as for China, at least on university campuses, I mean, the way in which our government is demonizing China and these wonderful people who came and studied in the United States and everything and are now going elsewhere. And acting like Taiwan Straits as though there's something bizarre about China being in the Taiwan Straits, whereas there's nothing bizarre about our being there. I had one debate at Harvard with somebody from a Johns Hopkins think tank, and he refers to us as having the disadvantage of distance. We have the disadvantage of distance. Yeah, it's not our hemisphere. And we have the Monroe Doctrine in our hemisphere and don't allow other powers to come in. And yet we think that the Taiwan Straits are ours to patrol. And I mean, I think let's let other people perhaps respond to your invitation, John, because it's certainly a very important topic. It's not quite the topic I was lecturing on tonight, but nonetheless, a very important topic. I see there's a question, but I can't see a name. It says 1847. And the person is asking to be unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Jake Aronov is my name. I'm calling from Chicago. Thank you for your talk. Sorry I missed the very beginning. Tell me your name again.
Elaine Scarry.
Okay. And could you repeat the bills that you were talking about?
Sure. One is the Markey Liu bill,
Okay.
and one is the Warren Smith bill. And do you want the congressional numbers?
Yeah, hold on.
Okay.
Okay, Markey Liu, L-E-U? L-E-W?
L-I-E-U. He's a Los Angeles representative.
Wait a minute. L-I-E-U, okay. And what's the number?
It's HR, so House of Representatives 669, and Senate
669.
and Senate
what?
1148.
1148. Okay. And that's the name of the bill is just no first use?
It's the Markey Liu bill for restricting first use in the absence of a congressional declaration of war.
Okay. All right. And then what's the other bill?
The Warren Smith bill is HR 2603.
Wait a minute. Warren Smith. Okay. Who's the Smith?
He's the representative in Adam Smith in the House, who has initiated the legislation with Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts.
Okay. HR, what is it?
2603.
2603. And Senate Bill?
1219.
1219. And what's the name of it?
Warren Smith bill. Oh, I'm sorry. No first use. I think it's just called the no first use bill.
No first use bill. Okay. So what's the difference between the two?
The difference between the two is that the Markey Liu bill sounds more procedural. I think it's actually likely to be more successful because it's very exact. It's saying that the president can't do this and can never use, not only can the president not do it in the absence of a declaration of war, but cannot do it in the absence of any authorization from Congress to so use the armed forces to do that kind of action. And it gives the constitutional basis for it. The Warren-Smith bill doesn't, as far as I know, specify the constitutional basis. It has an advantage in that it's a blanket statement of no first use. You know, you could, if you want to be contentious, you could say, oh, well, the Congress, the Markey-Liu bill would allow Congress to do it. Well, you can't have a Congress deliberating about whether to do a first strike. So that would just be an absurdity. But the Warren-Smith bill has the advantage that it's saying no first use period.
Okay. So you think that's the stronger of the two bills?
I think the Markey-Liu bill is the stronger.
Oh, okay. Now, how many co-sponsors are there for the two bills at this point?
The Markey-Liu bill has 8 co-sponsors in the Senate and 43 co-sponsors in the House.
Okay.
And the Warren-Smith bill has 2 in the House and 5 in the Senate.
Okay. So anyone from Illinois on either of the bills?
You know, you have to go to the bills, and if you press the tab that says co-sponsors, it will give you the full list, and it will give them in the date, the order in which they signed on. And then if you look over to the left, you'll see that it lets you press on, in your case, Illinois, and it will tell you who from Illinois has signed on.
Okay. All right.
Robin, do you have a question?
Yes, and this is in part response to John Lamperti and First Strike. I am a member of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and we've mulled over this issue quite a bit. And our question is, second strike. Let's say Russia attacks Ukraine with a nuclear weapon. So do we just attack? We have every right to attack Russia, therefore we can do second strike. I mean, the second strike is the key issue, and to refrain from revenge for the first strike is the step that is courageous that governments need to take. Am I being coherent here?
Yes, you are. And I agree with you. I think that our population has to make it clear that even if we get attacked and even if we get destroyed, we do not want another population to be similarly destroyed. After all, it wouldn't be the other population that had inflicted that injury on us. It would have been some leader or some hacker or whatever, whoever it was, or some accident. But I think that, you know, it's our obligation to make it clear that we don't want that. I mean, that we absolutely don't want that. Now, as a legal issue, there's a couple of things about it. First of all, the constitutional basis against it isn't quite as clear cut. I believe that it is clear, but for many people, that would be hard to convince. But let me say why I think that the Constitution does cover it.
Are you talking about second strike or just first strike?
Second strike. It clearly is makes first strike illegal. Absolutely, first strike and sole authority illegal. But second strike, I think it also makes illegal because since the president, I mean, earlier I mentioned this distinction that's made in the Russian Constitution between the fact that the president can act up to its own borders, but not beyond, and that if you want something more, you have to have Congress. That's also true in the Norwegian Constitution. And I believe that it's true in ours. After all, we say the president's commander in chief. That means if if our country were to be invaded, he could call out troops to start to repel those. But so in terms of an incoming strike, I think what that would mean is that he's certainly licensed to try and shoot down the weapon within our own border, but not to shoot some other population. But I think it would require some real argument to make this. Furthermore, there's a reason why we have a first use policy, and that's because anyone who is a nuclear strategist knows that second strike is a nightmare. Second strike is a nightmare. They're very unsure they can do it. That's why they've developed this vast program of first use with targets, all over the world, and the weapons, or the warheads already assigned to those cities, some of whom are so-called enemy right now, some of whom are not even our enemy. But the reason we have first strike is because second strike is not something that's easily within our power. I call your attention to what happened on 9/11 when the Pentagon of the United States could not take care of Flight 77, which hit what? The Pentagon. The Pentagon could not defend the Pentagon, let alone the rest of the country. And the explanation it gives for this is that there were a number of other planes in the air that also had their transponders off. Well, forgive me, but for the last 70 years, we've heard about how even though there are decoys in the air, we're going to be able to shoot down a missile. One outfit that has a tremendously helpful film on this, just a 3-minute long film, is the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows that this whole thing of being able to shoot down incoming planes is ridiculous. Maybe I can forward it to Jeremy and he can forward it to the rest of you. It goes on to show that right now we're talking about having satellite coverage, and then it shows that even to cover a small piece of terrain like North Korea would take hundreds of satellites rotating through the air. Even then, we're not likely to be able to do intercepts. But yeah, nonetheless, your basic point is one that I think is very important, namely that whether or not they're technologically able to do second use, we need to say no second use, no matter whether you can do it or can't do it, no second use. For many Americans, that's a very hard thing because it sounds like we're not going to defend the population. Well, we're not defending the population right now by setting up a situation that is a tinderbox ready to go off at any minute. Brad, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if you could comment on the idea that the United States seems to be moving toward developing smaller tactical nuclear warheads, and this idea to fight a limited nuclear war, and how that impacts a no first use policy.
Well, my view is one that I think is widely shared, that this is catastrophically dangerous because it lowers the taboo on using nuclear weapons, which is the one thing that we've had working for us, the fact that people feel that it is too immoral. And if suddenly you start having a small weapon that can be more easily used, well, then what does the other side say? You'll do that weapon plus one, and then the first country does that weapon plus two, et cetera. It's just a kind of, again, a kind of play script for reaching the point of all-out nuclear war. And besides, how small is small? Again, we can go to the work of Alan Roebuck and his colleagues that has just now come out with an updated report in the journal Nature Cell. Even the small exchange, which is under 3% of the total arsenal, will lead to 2 billion deaths from starvation. I don't know if anyone has a counter argument for that, or a sense of why tactical weapons, might be okay. But I think the conversations I've had with people seem to be fairly uniform in finding it a very alarming development, because of the capacity for escalation and cascading trouble. If you think of the way in which truth deteriorates during war, really, if somebody uses a nuclear weapon, do we really think the other's going to side is going to be, in there and announcing to its people and to the world that this fell within a tiny amount of damaging powers? It will take exactly 4 minutes or maybe 4 seconds before it will be understood to just have been a nuclear weapon, whether of small or large dimensions.
Thanks so much for all of your thoughtful questions tonight. Out of respect for time, we're just going to be wrapping up right now. But again, thanks so much for everybody attending. Let me just bring up these kind of closing remarks real quick. So many thanks to everyone who turned out and were part of our conversation tonight. Professor Scarry, can you let folks know how to best keep informed of your work, or if they would like to reach out to you, how they would do so?
Sure. Well, I have an email which is at Harvard, so it's very easy to find since you just go to Harvard and I'd be there with the email. I'll tell you what it is. It's escarry@FAS. That's Frank Alpha Sam, which stands for Faculty of Arts and Science. escarry@fas.harvard.edu.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And you can stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action by checking us out at newhampshirepeaceaction.org and look us up on our Facebook for more about what we're working on and what's next in our programming. The next conversation is on August 29th at 7 p.m. It's on global common security, the new era of great power confrontation and common security alternatives, featuring Joseph Gerson. And then there's a break, and it looks like on September 26th at 7 p.m., our next conversation, or that conversation series for that night, is how excessive military spending affects us locally, featuring the Granite State Organizing Project's Executive Director, Sarah Jane Kanoy. And the series remains free and open to everyone. However, if you're able to contribute at this time, your financial support makes it possible for us to keep doing this work. So to donate, you can go to newhampshirepeaceaction.org/donate. I hope you guys have a great night and hope to see you soon. Thank you.